The auctioneer's hammer fell with a sickening thud. "Sold to the gentleman in the back for $15,000. But as the crowd turned to see who had placed the winning bid, all they found was an empty chair and a stack of crisp bills. Left behind, the mysterious stranger had vanished, leaving everyone wondering who was he and why had he just purchased a human being only to disappear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Madison Rivers had always believed that Millbrook was the most beautiful place on earth. The small town, nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, seemed frozen in time, where the morning mist danced over fields of wildflowers and the sound of rushing water from Miller's Creek provided a constant, soothing melody. Main Street was lined with historic brick buildings that housed family businesses passed down through generations. Thompson's Hardware, Chen's General Store, and the beloved Sunrise Diner, where everybody knew your name and your usual order. At 22, Madison possessed the kind of natural beauty that turned heads without her even realizing it. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight like spun copper, and her green eyes sparkled with an intelligence and warmth that drew people to her like moths to flame. She had graduated valedictorian from Millbrook High just 4 years earlier, earning a full scholarship to the state university. But when her mother, Caroline, was diagnosed with early-onset dementia, Madison made the difficult decision to stay home and care for her. Now she worked as the head librarian at the Millbrook Public Library, a job that perfectly suited her love of books and her desire to help others. Children would gather around her during story time, completely mesmerized as she brought characters to life with different voices and animated gestures. Teenagers sought her out for help with research projects, and elderly residents came by just to chat about the latest bestseller or reminisce about books from their youth. The library had become Madison's sanctuary. She had transformed the old Carnegie building into a vibrant community hub, organizing book clubs, literacy programs, and cultural events that brought the whole town together. Her small apartment above the library was cozy and filled with plants, vintage furniture she'd restored herself, and shelves upon shelves of books that overflowed into every room. Madison's father, Robert Rivers, had once been the pride of Millbrook. A decorated Army veteran who served 2 tours in Afghanistan, he returned home with a Bronze Star and the respect of everyone in town. He married his high school sweetheart, Caroline, and they seemed to have the perfect life. Robert worked as a foreman at the local lumber mill, a job that paid well and allowed him to provide a comfortable middle-class lifestyle for his family. But the war had left invisible scars on Robert's soul. The nightmares came first, violent, sweaty episodes where he would wake up screaming about explosions and fallen comrades. Then came the drinking, which he claimed helped quiet the demons in his head. Caroline tried to get him help, scheduling appointments with VA counselors and support groups, but Robert was too proud to admit he was struggling. When Caroline's diagnosis came 3 years ago, something broke inside Robert. Watching the love of his life slowly forget their shared memories, their inside jokes, even his face sometimes, was more than he could bear. The drinking escalated, and soon Robert discovered that poker games at Jimmy's bar helped him forget his pain for a few precious hours. At first, Robert was actually good at poker. His military training had taught him to read people, to stay calm under pressure, and to calculate odds quickly. He would come home with an extra $100 or $200, proudly presenting the money to Madison to help with household expenses and Caroline's mounting medical bills. Madison felt uneasy about the gambling, but she couldn't argue with the results when they were struggling to make ends meet. The Rivers family had always been close-knit. Sunday dinners were sacred, with Caroline making her famous pot roast and homemade biscuits while Robert and Madison would catch up on each other's lives. Even as Caroline's condition worsened, they maintained these traditions, with Madison taking over more of the cooking while Robert would patiently help Caroline remember the names of old friends in family photos. Madison had dreams beyond Millbrook. Though she rarely spoke of them, she longed to travel, to see the places she'd only read about in books. She had applications to graduate programs in library science at universities in bigger cities, dreams of maybe working at the Library of Congress or the New York Public Library someday. But those dreams felt selfish now, with her mother's condition deteriorating and her father struggling to cope. The town doctor, Dr. Patricia Hoffman, had become like family to them. She made house calls to check on Caroline, adjusting medications, and providing guidance on managing the progression of the disease. Madison had learned to remember Caroline's memory, keeping detailed notes of good days and bad days, medication schedules, and the little things that brought her mother joy, like the wind chimes on the front porch or the photo album of Madison's childhood that Caroline would flip through for hours. Madison's best friend since childhood, Jessica Martinez, worked as a nurse at the regional hospital an hour away. Jessica would drive down on weekends to help with Caroline's care and to provide Madison with much-needed emotional support. They would sit on the front porch swing after Caroline went to bed, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about everything and nothing, the way only lifelong friends can. The local church, Millbrook Community Fellowship, had rallied around the Rivers family. Pastor Williams organized meal trains and volunteer schedules so that Caroline was never alone during the day while Madison worked. Mrs. Henderson from across the street would sit with Caroline in the afternoons, reading scripture or simply holding her hand when the confusion became overwhelming. Madison had also found solace in her volunteer work with the local literacy program. Twice a week, she would drive to the neighboring county to teach adults how to read. Many of her students were immigrants working in the region's apple orchards, eager to learn English and improve their circumstances. Their determination and gratitude reminded Madison that even in the darkest times, there was always hope for a better tomorrow. The family's financial situation had become increasingly precarious as Caroline's care costs mounted. Insurance covered some expenses, but not the specialized medications or the private care aide Madison had hired for the mornings. Robert's gambling winnings had become a necessary part of their budget, which made Madison increasingly uncomfortable, but unable to object. Life in Millbrook moved at a gentle pace that suited Madison's nature. She would start each morning with a run along the creek, stopping to feed the ducks at Miller's Pond before heading to the library. Evenings were spent reading to her mother or working on the Historical Society's project to digitize old town records and photographs. It was a simple life, but it was filled with purpose and love. Madison had turned down several marriage proposals over the years, including one from David Chen, whose family owned the general store, and another from her high school boyfriend, Mark Thompson, who had taken over his father's hardware business. She cared for both men, but she knew she couldn't commit to anyone while her mother needed her so desperately. Besides, neither relationship had ever felt like the epic love stories she read about in the novels that lined her apartment walls. The library had become Madison's greatest professional achievement. Under her leadership, circulation had doubled, and the building now hosted everything from computer classes for seniors to poetry readings by local authors. She had even managed to secure a small grant to create a maker space where teenagers could learn coding and 3D printing. The town council had recently approved funding for a major renovation that would expand the children's section and add a cafe. Madison's days were predictable and comforting. Morning coffee with her mother while reviewing the daily routine with their care aide, Mrs. Patterson. 8 hours at the library helping patrons and managing programs. Evening visits with Caroline, dinner preparation, and household management. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful work that connected her to every person in Millbrook. But beneath the surface of this idyllic small-town life, storm clouds were gathering. Madison had begun to notice subtle changes in her father's behavior. Coming home later from his poker games, being more secretive about his winnings and losses, and seeming increasingly agitated and distracted. She had no idea that Robert's luck at the poker table had taken a dramatic turn for the worse, or that he had begun borrowing money from increasingly dangerous people to cover his mounting debts. The perfect world that Madison had built around, caring for her family and serving her community, was about to come crashing down in ways she never could have imagined. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came on a Tuesday morning in late September. Madison arrived at the library to find Robert sitting in his truck outside, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed, stubble covering his jaw. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Madison approached the driver's side window, concerned about flooding her voice. Robert startled, as if he hadn't seen her coming. "Oh, Maddie, I needed to talk to you about something." His voice was hoarse, strained in a way she'd never heard before. "Is it Mom? Is she okay?" No, she's fine. Mrs. Patterson is with her." Robert rubbed his face with both hands. "It's about money, sweetheart. We need to talk about money." Madison felt her stomach drop. Over the past few months, she had noticed changes in their financial situation that didn't add up. Robert's poker winnings had become erratic. Some weeks he'd come home with significant amounts, but increasingly often he'd return empty-handed, claiming he'd had bad luck or that the cards just weren't falling right. What Madison didn't know was that Robert's gambling had evolved far beyond the friendly poker games at Jimmy's bar. 3 months earlier, he had discovered an underground casino operating out of a warehouse on the outskirts of Richmond, about 2 hours away. The stakes were higher, the games more intense, and the players were a different breed entirely, men in expensive suits who treated $10,000 like pocket change. Robert had initially been drawn to the high-stakes games because of one spectacular night where he'd won $8,000 in a single hand of Texas Hold'em. That victory had felt like vindication, proof that he still had the skills and instincts that had kept him alive in Afghanistan. For one glorious evening, he felt like the man he used to be, confident, capable, in control. But the house always wins eventually, and Robert's beginner's luck had run out catastrophically. He started chasing his losses, convinced that one big win would solve all their problems. Caroline's medical expenses were mounting, and Madison's salary at the library barely covered their basic living costs. The mortgage payments on their modest house were becoming increasingly difficult to manage, especially with the modifications they'd needed to make for Caroline's safety and mobility. The underground casino was run by a man named Vincent Torino, whose legitimate businesses included several restaurants and a construction company, but whose real money came from less legal enterprises. Torino was in his 50s, impeccably dressed, and possessed the kind of cold intelligence that made even hardened criminals nervous. He had a reputation for being fair in his dealings, but absolutely ruthless when crossed. Robert's descent into serious gambling debt had been swift and brutal. After that initial big win, he had convinced himself that he could quit his day job at the lumber mill and support his family through poker winnings alone. The fantasy was seductive. No more backbreaking physical labor, no more taking orders from supervisors half his age, no more feeling like a failure every time he looked at Caroline's medical bills. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The reality was very different. Over the course of 6 weeks, Robert had lost not only his initial winnings, but also his entire savings account. Caroline's small inheritance from her parents, and the equity they had built up in their home. When his cash ran out, Torino's associates had been happy to extend him credit, with interest rates that would have made loan sharks blush. Madison sat across from her father in the library's small break room, studying his haggard appearance. With a growing alarm, Robert's hands shook slightly as he tried to explain their financial situation without revealing the full scope of his gambling addiction. "The mill is cutting back hours," Robert lied, his eyes focused on the table between them. "And with your mother's new medications, we're falling behind on everything. The mortgage, the utilities, even Mrs. Patterson's salary." "How behind?" Madison asked quietly. Robert's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "About $15,000. The number hit Madison like a physical blow. $15,000 might as well have been $1 million for a family living paycheck to paycheck. Her salary at the library was modest, and they had no significant assets beyond their house, which Robert had already secretly mortgaged too. "The hilt. There has to be something we can do," Madison said, her mind racing through possibilities. "I could take a second job, or maybe we could refinance the house again." Robert's face crumpled with guilt. He wanted to tell her the truth, that the $15,000 was just the tip of the iceberg, that his actual debt to Torino was closer to $75,000 when interest and penalties were included. But the shame was too overwhelming, and the fear of losing Madison's respect was more than he could bear. What Robert didn't tell Madison was that Torino had already made his expectations clear. During their last meeting at the warehouse, Torino had sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, his fingers steepled, his expression patient but implacable. "Robert, my friend," Torino had said in his cultured voice, "you understand that I run a business, not a charity. People depend on me to maintain certain standards, certain expectations about how debts are handled." The implicit threat had been crystal clear. Torino's reputation in the underground gambling world depended on his ability to collect what was owed to him. Men who failed to pay their debts had a tendency to experience unfortunate accidents, broken bones, destroyed property, or worse. "I need more time," Robert had pleaded. "My daughter doesn't know about any of this. If I could just explain the situation to her, maybe we could work something out." Torino had smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Time is a luxury, Robert, and luxuries cost extra." He had slid a piece of paper across the desk. "Your debt now stands at $75,000. The interest continues to compound daily." The number had been so staggering that Robert had actually felt dizzy. $75,000 was more than he made in 2 years at the lumber mill. Even if he worked every day for the rest of his life, he would never be able to pay back such an enormous sum. Back in the library break room, Madison was trying to process the financial crisis her father had presented to her. $15,000 was overwhelming enough, but she was determined to find a solution. "I could sell my car," Madison offered. "It's not worth much, but maybe a few $1,000s. And I have some jewelry from Grandma." Robert's heart broke, listening to his daughter's desperate attempts to solve a problem that was far worse than she could imagine. Madison's grandmother's jewelry might be worth $1,000 at most, and her car was a 10-year-old Honda Civic with over 150,000 miles on it. "That's not going to be enough, sweetheart," Robert said gently. "We need to think bigger." Madison felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, bigger?" Robert couldn't meet her eyes. "Maybe we should consider selling the house." The suggestion hit Madison like a slap. Their house wasn't just a building. It was Caroline's anchor to familiarity in her confused world. Every room held memories that Caroline could still sometimes access. The kitchen where she had taught Madison to bake cookies, the living room where they had spent countless evenings watching old movies, the garden where Caroline had grown prize-winning tomatoes for the county fair. "Dad, we can't sell the house." Mum needs the routine, the familiar surroundings. Dr. Hoffman said that moving dementia patients can cause severe psychological trauma. Robert knew Madison was right, but he was running out of options. Torino had given him 2 weeks to come, up with a substantial payment, and Robert had already exhausted every legal avenue he could think of. He had tried to get a loan from the bank, but his credit was destroyed. He had approached friends and relatives, but none of them had the kind of money he needed. The conversation was interrupted by Madison's phone, buzzing with a text message from Mrs. Patterson. "Caroline is having a difficult morning. She's asking for you." Madison immediately stood up. "I need to go check on Mom. We'll figure this out tonight, okay? There has to be a solution." As Madison hurried home, Robert remained in the library break room, his head in his hands. He was trapped between his desperate love for his family and the crushing weight of his debts. The thought of telling Madison the full truth about his gambling addiction filled him with such shame that he felt physically ill. That evening, Robert drove back to Richmond for another meeting with Torino. The warehouse was buzzing with activity, poker games, blackjack tables, and other forms of gambling that attracted wealthy men looking for thrills that legal casinos couldn't provide. Torino received Robert in his private office, a luxuriously appointed space that felt more like a gentleman's club than the back room of a criminal enterprise. Crystal decanters filled with expensive whiskey lined the shelves, and original oil paintings decorated the walls. "Robert," Torino greeted him, with false warmth. "I trust you have good news for me?" Robert's mouth was dry as dust. "I need more time. My family doesn't know about the gambling, and I'm trying to handle this without destroying their lives." Torino's expression hardened. "Your family situation is not my concern. What concerns me is the money you owe me and the example I set for other clients who might be tempted to default on their obligations." "Please," Robert begged, "I'll sign over the deed to my house. It's worth at least $40,000. "Your house is already mortgaged beyond its value," Torino replied coldly. "I've had my people look into your finances, Robert. You have no assets worth claiming." The revelation that Torino had been investigating his family sent a spike of terror through Robert's chest. "What do you want from me? I don't have the money and I can't magic it out of thin air." Torino leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the desk. "Actually, Robert, you do have something of value, something that could settle your debt entirely." Robert felt a terrible premonition creeping over him. "What are you talking about?" "Your daughter," Torino said simply. "Madison. I've made some inquiries around Millbrook. Beautiful girl, intelligent, well-regarded in the community. A librarian with an excellent reputation." Robert shot to his feet, his chair toppling backward. "Absolutely not. Whatever sick idea you have in your head, the answer is no." Torino remained calm, unruffled by Robert's outburst. "Sit down, Robert. Let me explain how this works." Against his better judgment, Robert remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides. "There are certain men in my circle," Torino continued, "wealthy individuals who are looking for companionship, refined, educated women who can serve as wives, hostesses, whatever their particular needs might be. These arrangements are quite lucrative." The words hit Robert like a physical assault. "You're talking about selling my daughter like she's property." "I'm talking about a business transaction that would eliminate your debt and provide your daughter with a very comfortable lifestyle, much more comfortable than what she could expect as a small-town librarian." Robert's vision blurred with rage. "She would never agree to something like that." Torino's smile was arctic. "The beauty of debt collection, Robert, is that people rarely have choices. They have consequences." He pressed a button on his desk, and 2 large men entered the office. "I'm giving you 1 week to bring me Madison, or I'll come to Millbrook myself to collect what's owed to me. And I promise you, my methods of collection are far less gentle than what I'm offering now." Robert stumbled out of the warehouse in a state of shock, his mind reeling from Torino's ultimatum. The drive back to Millbrook passed in a blur of panic and desperation. He had 1 week to find $75,000, or he would have to make a choice that would destroy everything he had ever loved. When he arrived home, Madison was sitting with Caroline, reading aloud from one of Caroline's favorite romance novels. The scene was so peaceful, so normal, that Robert felt like he was looking at it through bulletproof glass, something beautiful and precious that he could see but no longer touch. Madison looked up when he entered the living room. "How did it go at the bank?" she asked hopefully. Robert couldn't bring himself to tell her that he hadn't been to any bank. "Still working on it," he mumbled. "These things take time." But time was the one thing Robert Rivers no longer had. The week that followed Torino's ultimatum was the longest of Robert Rivers' life. He threw himself into increasingly desperate schemes to raise the money, each more unrealistic than the last. He contacted every veterans organization he could find, begging for emergency assistance. He drove to 3 different pawnshops, trying to sell his Bronze Star and other military decorations, only to discover they were worth less than $50 combined. Robert even attempted to rob his own workplace, staying late at the lumber mill one evening, with plans to break into the company's safe. But as he stood outside the office building with a crowbar in his hands, staring at his reflection in the dark windows, he couldn't bring himself to cross that final line. He was many things: an addict, a liar, a failure as a father and husband, but he wasn't a thief. Meanwhile, Madison threw herself into her own research, completely unaware of the true scope of their crisis. She spent hours at her computer looking into refinancing options, second mortgages, and emergency assistance programs. She even swallowed her pride and called her ex-boyfriend, David Chen, asking if his family might be willing to provide a loan against her future salary. "Madison, you know I'd help if I could," David said during their awkward phone conversation, "but $15,000 is more than the store makes in profit for 6 months. Have you considered talking to Pastor Williams? The church might be able to organize some kind of fundraiser." The suggestion of asking for charity made Madison's cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she was running out of options. That Sunday, she approached Pastor Williams after the service, explaining their financial difficulties in vague terms, while Caroline sat peacefully in a nearby pew, humming hymns to herself. Pastor Williams was a kind man in his 60s who had served the Millbrook community for over 30 years. His weathered face creased with concern as Madison spoke. $15,000 is a substantial amount, Madison, more than our emergency fund could cover, but let me make some calls, see what I can arrange." Madison felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. "Thank you, Pastor. I know it's a lot to ask, but we're really desperate." "Families help families," Pastor Williams replied, patting her shoulder gently. "That's what we do here." But even as Madison was exploring legitimate options, Robert's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Torino's men had begun making their presence known around Millbrook, conducting what they called reconnaissance, but what felt more like psychological warfare. Madison first noticed the black SUV on Wednesday morning. It was parked across from the library when she arrived for work, its tinted windows making it impossible to see inside. When she left for lunch, it was gone, but when she returned, it was back in the same spot. The vehicle appeared again on Thursday and Friday, always with the same 2 occupants, men in dark suits who seemed to be watching the library's entrance. On Friday afternoon, Madison finally worked up the courage to approach the vehicle. But as she crossed the street, the SUV's engine started and it pulled away without a word. Madison stood on the sidewalk, her heart pounding, wondering if she was being paranoid or if there really was something sinister about the men's behavior. That evening, she mentioned the incident to Robert, who visibly paled at her description of the vehicle. "It's probably nothing, sweetheart," he said, his voice strained. "Maybe they're developers looking at property values, or insurance investigators, something like that." But Robert knew exactly who the men were and why they were watching his daughter. Torino was applying pressure, making it clear that he had easy access to Madison whenever he chose to collect his debt. The message was crystal clear. Robert was running out of time. Saturday morning brought the phone call that shattered what remained of Robert's world. He answered on the second ring, recognizing Torino's number on the caller ID. "Good morning, Robert." Torino's voice was pleasant, conversational. "I trust you've had a productive week?" Robert's mouth went dry. "I'm still working on it. I need more time. Time, as I've explained, is a luxury I don't provide free of charge. Your debt has now grown to $82,000 with accumulated interest and late fees." The number hit Robert like a sledgehammer. Even if he had somehow managed to scrape together the original $75,000, he was now even further behind than when he'd started. "I can't possibly raise that much money," Robert whispered into the phone. "Of course you can't," Torino agreed cheerfully. "Which brings us back to our previous discussion about alternative payment methods. I've arranged something special for tomorrow evening, a private auction at my warehouse. Very exclusive, very discreet. Your daughter will be the featured item." Robert's knees buckled and he sank into the nearest chair. "Vincent, please, I'm begging you. There has to be another way." "There is no other way, Robert. Tomorrow at 8 o'clock, you'll bring Madison to the warehouse. She'll be auctioned to the highest bidder among my most distinguished clients. The proceeds will more than cover your debt, and everyone walks away satisfied." "She'll never agree to come with me," Robert protested weakly. Torino's laugh was cold and sharp. "Then you'll have to be creative about how you get her there. Because, Robert, if you don't show up tomorrow night with your daughter, my associates will come to Millbrook to collect both of you, and I promise you that scenario will be far less pleasant for everyone involved." The line went dead, leaving Robert staring at the phone in his trembling hand. He had less than 24 hours to figure out how to deliver his own daughter to a human trafficking auction, or Torino's thugs would descend on Millbrook like a plague. Robert spent the rest of Saturday in a fugue state, mechanically going through the motions of normal life, while his mind raced through increasingly desperate scenarios. He could warn Madison and tell her to run, but where could she go so Torino wouldn't find her? He could call the police, but what evidence did he have? And even if they believed him, how could he explain his own role in creating the situation without destroying Madison's opinion of him forever? The worst part was watching Madison go about her day, completely oblivious to the danger closing in around her. She made breakfast for Caroline, helped her mother get dressed, and chatted cheerfully about the library's upcoming book fair. Her innocence and trust felt like a knife twisting in Robert's chest. Sunday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that normally filled Robert with contentment. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, and the morning air carried the scent of wood smoke from neighbors' chimneys. It was the kind of day that made Millbrook feel like paradise on earth. Madison attended the morning church service with Caroline, sitting in their usual pew and singing hymns with her beautiful, clear voice. Pastor Williams caught Madison's eye during his sermon and nodded encouragingly, silently communicating that he was still working on their financial problems. After church, Madison helped Caroline into the car and drove them home, chattering about the upcoming week's activities. Caroline was having a good day, responding appropriately to conversation and even making jokes about Mrs. Henderson's new hat. "I love you, sweetheart," Caroline said suddenly as Madison helped her out of the car. "You're such a good daughter. I'm so proud of you." Madison felt tears prick her eyes. Caroline's moments of clarity were becoming increasingly rare, and each one felt like a precious gift. "I love you too, Mom. More than you'll ever know." Robert spent Sunday afternoon in his workshop, ostensibly repairing a broken chair, but actually trying to work up the courage for what he knew he had to do. He had constructed an elaborate lie about needing Madison to accompany him to Richmond for a meeting with a potential lender. The story was full of holes, but Robert was banking on Madison's trust and her desperation to help solve their financial crisis. At 5 o'clock, Robert approached Madison in the kitchen where she was preparing dinner. "Maddie, I need you to come with me somewhere tonight." Madison looked up from the pot roast she was seasoning. "Where?" "Richmond. I've got a meeting with a man who might be able to help us with a loan. He insisted on meeting you personally before he'll agree to lend us the money." Madison frowned. "That seems unusual. Why would a lender need to meet me?" Robert's palms were sweating as he struggled to maintain eye contact with his daughter. "He's not a traditional lender, more of a private investor. He wants to make sure we're good for the money before he takes the risk." "What about Mom? I don't like leaving her. In the evening, she gets confused when the sun goes down. Mrs. Patterson agreed to stay late tonight. She's already here." Robert gestured toward the living room, where their part-time caregiver was sitting with Caroline, working on a jigsaw puzzle. Madison hesitated, her instincts telling her that something was off about the entire situation. But her desperate desire to solve their financial problems overrode her caution. "How long will we be gone?" "A couple of hours at most," Robert lied. "We should be back by 10 or 11. Madison nodded reluctantly. "Okay, let me just finish getting dinner ready for Mom and Mrs. Patterson." As Madison busied herself in the kitchen, Robert stepped outside and sent a text message to Torino. "We'll be there at 8. The response came immediately. "Excellent. Don't disappoint me, Robert." Robert deleted both messages and slipped his phone back into his pocket, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the device. In 3 hours, he would be delivering his daughter to men who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. The knowledge felt like poison coursing through his veins. The drive to Richmond was torture. Madison sat in the passenger seat, nervously adjusting her outfit, a simple blue dress that she thought would make a good impression on a potential lender. She had styled her hair neatly and applied light makeup, wanting to look professional and trustworthy. "Tell me more about this investor," Madison said as they merged onto the highway. "What kind of business is he in?" Robert's mouth was so dry he could barely speak. "Import and export, real estate, various investments." Each word felt like broken glass in his throat. "And he specifically asked to meet me. He likes to know the families he's helping," Robert replied, the lie sitting like lead in his stomach. As they approached the warehouse district on the outskirts of Richmond, Madison began to feel genuinely alarmed. The area was industrial and desolate, with few streetlights, and no obvious signs of legitimate business activity. "Dad, where exactly are we going?" Madison asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Robert pulled into the parking lot of Torino's warehouse, his heart hammering against his ribs. The building was massive and foreboding, with several expensive cars parked outside and men in suits standing near the entrance. "This doesn't look like any bank or lending office I've ever seen," Madison said, her alarm growing by the second. Before Robert could respond, 2 of Torino's men approached their car. Madison instinctively reached for the door lock, but one of the men was already opening her door. "Miss Rivers," the man said politely, "Mr. Torino is waiting for you inside." Madison turned to her father, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. "Dad, what's going on? Who are these people?" Robert couldn't meet her gaze. Tears were streaming down his face as he whispered, "I'm sorry, Maddie. I'm so sorry. I didn't have a choice." The moment Madison realized she had been betrayed by her own father was like watching her entire world collapse in slow motion. The trust, the love, the sense of safety she had always associated with Robert Rivers crumbled into dust. She had been led like a lamb to slaughter by the man who was supposed to protect her above all others. "Please step out of the car, Miss Rivers," the man repeated, his tone still polite but with an underlying firmness that made it clear refusal wasn't an option. Madison looked once more at her father, searching his face for some sign that this was all a terrible mistake. But Robert's expression told her everything she needed to know. He had sold her to pay his debts, and there was no going back. With trembling legs, Madison stepped out of the car and into the nightmare that would define the rest of her life. The interior of Torino's warehouse had been transformed into something resembling an exclusive gentleman's club. Crystal chandeliers hung from the industrial ceiling, casting warm light over Persian rugs and leather furniture arranged in intimate seating areas. The concrete floors had been covered with rich hardwood, and oil paintings in gilded frames adorned the walls. It was opulent and disturbing, a veneer of civilization painted over something fundamentally barbaric. Madison was escorted through the main floor, past groups of well-dressed men nursing expensive whiskey and engaged in quiet conversation. Their eyes followed her movement, with the calculating assessment of livestock buyers examining prime cattle. Some were older, distinguished-looking gentlemen who appeared to be wealthy businessmen or politicians. Others were younger, with the hard-edged look of new money made through questionable means. "This way, Miss Rivers," her escort directed, guiding her toward a raised platform at the far end of the warehouse. Madison's legs felt like rubber, and her heart was beating so fast she worried she might faint. The reality of her situation was settling in with crystalline clarity. She was about to be auctioned off like property to the highest bidder. Vincent Torino stood near the platform, resplendent in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. He was holding a crystal glass of champagne and chatting casually with a silver-haired man who wore a Rolex that probably cost more than Madison's annual salary. When Torino spotted Madison approaching, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Ah, Miss Rivers, welcome to my establishment." Torino's voice was cultured and warm, as if he were greeting a guest at a dinner party rather than a victim of human trafficking. "You look absolutely lovely this evening." Madison found her voice, though. It came out as barely more than a whisper. "Please, Mr. Torino, there has to be some other way to handle my father's debt. I have a job. I can make payments." Torino's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew cold. "My dear girl, your father's debt is far beyond what a librarian's salary could ever address. Besides, this arrangement benefits everyone involved. You'll be provided with a lifestyle of luxury and comfort that you could never achieve on your own. This is slavery," Madison said, her voice growing stronger despite her terror. "It's illegal. People will look for me." "Slavery is such an ugly word," Torino replied, his tone remaining conversational. "I prefer to think of this as an exclusive matchmaking service for discriminating gentlemen who appreciate quality. As for people looking for you, well, your father will explain that. You've decided to pursue opportunities in a larger city. Small-town girls leave home all the time to seek their fortunes." Madison's mind raced, searching for any possible escape route. The warehouse was filled with Torino's men, all of whom looked like they could handle any resistance she might offer. The main entrance was too far away, and she had no idea if there were other exits. Even if she could somehow break free, she was in an unfamiliar city with no transportation and no allies. "May I at least call my mother?" Madison asked desperately. "She has dementia. She'll be confused if I don't come home tonight." For the first time, Torino's composure cracked slightly. "Your mother's condition is unfortunate, but it's not my concern. You'll have opportunities to contact your family once your new situation is established." The auction was scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock, giving potential bidders time to circulate and examine their potential purchase. Madison was positioned on a small stage area where men could approach and ask her questions. The experience was humiliating beyond anything she could have imagined. A portly man in his 60s with gold teeth and a thick New York accent was the first to approach. "You got any special skills, sweetheart? Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing?" Madison stared at him in disbelief. "I'm a librarian. I have a master's degree in information science." The man laughed and turned to his companion. "College girl, fancy, probably thinks she's too good for housework." Another bidder, a younger man with slicked back hair and an expensive watch, asked more personal questions. "Have you ever been married? Any kids? Medical problems I should know about?" Madison's cheeks burned with shame as she realized these men were evaluating her reproductive potential along with her other qualities. "This is insane," she muttered. "You can't just buy human beings in the 21st century." "Sure we can," the young man replied with a grin. "Money talks, sweetheart. Always has, always will." As the evening progressed, Madison learned more about the twisted world she had been thrust into. The auction was apparently a semi-regular event, with Torino providing merchandise to wealthy clients who wanted more control over their domestic arrangements than traditional dating or marriage could provide. Some of the women were there to pay off debts like Madison, while others had been recruited from desperate circumstances, homeless shelters, addiction treatment centers, or abusive relationships. Madison also discovered that winning a bid didn't necessarily mean marriage. Some of the bidders were looking for domestic servants, others for companions to accompany them to social events, and still others for purposes that Madison didn't want to contemplate. The arrangements typically lasted between 1 and 5 years, depending on the terms negotiated with Torino. At 8:45, Torino took the stage with a wireless microphone, tapping the crystal with a silver spoon to get everyone's attention. The warehouse fell silent, except for the soft jazz music playing in the background. "Gentlemen, welcome to tonight's exclusive event," Torino began, his voice carrying easily through the space. "As always, I remind you that discretion is paramount. What happens here stays here, and payment is due in full immediately upon winning a bid." Madison stood frozen beside the platform, watching the sea of male faces turn toward Torino with rapt attention. These weren't cartoon villains or obvious criminals. They were successful, respectable-looking men who had chosen to participate in something monstrous because they had the money and power to do so. Tonight's featured item is Miss Madison Rivers, a 22-year-old college graduate from Virginia. Miss Rivers is intelligent, well-educated, and comes from a respectable family. She has no criminal record, no substance abuse issues, and no significant medical concerns. Madison felt bile rise in her throat as Torino described her like livestock at a county fair. The casual dehumanization was almost worse than the actual captivity. These men genuinely didn't see her as a person with rights, dreams, and autonomy. "Bidding will start at $10,000, Torino announced. "Do I hear 10,000? Several hands shot up immediately. Madison closed her eyes, unable to watch, as grown men competed for the right to own her. "I have 10,000. Do I hear 15? More?" Hands. The bidding escalated quickly, with multiple participants driving the price higher and higher. Madison could hear Torino's voice calling out increasingly large amounts, but the numbers felt surreal and disconnected from reality. 25,000 from the gentleman in the blue tie. Do I hear 30? Madison forced herself to open her eyes and look at the bidders. The man in the blue tie was probably in his 50s, with grey hair and the soft look of someone who had never done physical labor. He was examining her with the same expression she had seen on her father's face when he was evaluating horses at the county fair. 30,000 from Mr. Chen in the front row. Do I hear 35? Madison's heart sank as she recognized the name Chen. Could this be related to David's family somehow? Was everyone she had ever trusted involved in this nightmare? The bidding continued to climb. 40,000, 50,000, 60,000. Madison had never imagined that anyone would pay such enormous amounts for a human being, but the men in Torino's warehouse seemed to view the escalating price as a measure of her desirability rather than an indication of the transaction's obscenity. 75,000 from Mr. Blackwood, Torino called out. Do I hear 80? Madison looked toward the back of the room where Mr. Blackwood was apparently seated, but the lighting made it difficult to see clearly. What she could make out was a tall figure in an expensive dark suit, standing rather than sitting like most of the other bidders. The bidding slowed as the price approached 6 figures. At $85,000, only 3 men were still actively participating. Madison found herself in the surreal position of hoping that whichever man won would at least treat her humanely, though she had no basis for making such judgments. Do I hear 90,000? Torino called out. Silence fell over the warehouse. 85,000 appeared to be the limit for most of the bidders. Going once at 85,000. Torino raised his gavel. 150,000. The voice came from the back of the warehouse, clear and confident. A collective gasp went up from the assembled bidders. Someone had nearly doubled the previous high bid in a single stroke. Madison strained to see who had made the astronomical offer, but the figure remained in shadow. What kind of person had that much money to spend on purchasing another human being? Did I hear correctly? Torino asked, his composure shaken for the first time that evening. $150,000? You heard correctly, the mysterious bidder replied. His voice was deep and carried a slight accent that Madison couldn't identify. That's quite generous, Torino stammered. Do I hear any other bids? The warehouse remained silent. $150,000 was apparently beyond the reach of even these wealthy criminals. Going once, going twice. Torino paused, giving the other bidders one final chance to respond. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $150,000. Madison felt her knees buckle as the reality hit her. She had just been purchased for more money than most people made in 3 years. The mysterious Mr. Blackwood now owned her completely, and she had no idea what he intended to do with his expensive acquisition. As the crowd began to disperse, Madison remained frozen on the platform, unable to process what had just happened. Torino approached her with a satisfied smile, clearly pleased with the evening's financial outcome. Congratulations, Miss Rivers. You've just set a new record for our auctions. Mr. Blackwood must see something very special in you. When do I meet him? Madison asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. He prefers to handle the transfer of ownership privately, Torino replied. You'll be taken to a secure location tonight, and he'll collect you tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I suggest you get some rest. Tomorrow begins your new life. Madison was escorted to a small but comfortable room in the back of the warehouse. It was furnished like a hotel room, with a queen-sized bed, a private bathroom, and even a small television. But the door locked from the outside, and the single window was barred. Despite the creature's comforts, Madison was unmistakably a prisoner. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the blue dress she had chosen so carefully for what she thought would be a meeting with a legitimate lender. The irony was crushing. She had dressed to make a good impression, and she had succeeded beyond her wildest nightmares. Madison's thoughts turned to her mother, who would wake up tomorrow morning expecting her daughter to be there with breakfast and medication. Caroline would be confused and frightened when Madison didn't appear, and Robert would have to invent some explanation for her absence. The thought of her mother's distress was almost unbearable. She also thought about the library, her co-workers, and the patrons who depended on her. Monday morning would bring children expecting story time, elderly residents looking for their weekly book recommendations, and students needing help with research projects. Madison had never missed a day of work without calling in advance, and her unexplained absence would raise questions that Robert would somehow have to answer. Around midnight, Madison heard vehicles departing from the warehouse parking lot. The auction was over, and the bidders were returning to their normal lives where they could pretend to be respectable citizens while participating in human trafficking for entertainment. Madison lay down on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine what tomorrow would bring. She had been purchased by someone calling himself Mr. Blackwood for an astronomical sum, but she knew nothing about him except that he had enough money to outbid a room full of wealthy criminals. Would he be cruel or kind, young or old? What did he want from her that was worth $150,000? Madison had read enough news stories to know that human trafficking victims often faced horrific abuse, but she also clung to the hope that someone willing to pay such an enormous amount might have some interest in preserving his investment. As dawn approached, Madison finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams of her mother calling her name and finding only empty rooms. She had no way of knowing that in just a few hours her life would take another unexpected turn that would challenge everything she thought she understood about her situation. The mysterious Mr. Blackwood was not at all what anyone expected, and his motivations for purchasing Madison would prove to be far more complex than simple ownership of another human being. Madison woke to the sound of a key turning in the lock. Sunlight streamed through the barred window, and for a confused moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous night crashed back into her consciousness with brutal clarity. The warehouse, the auction, being sold to a stranger for $150,000. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore simple clothes and carried a breakfast tray, moving with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to service work. "Good morning, Miss Rivers," the woman said softly. "I'm Elena Vasquez. I work for Mr. Blackwood. I've brought you some breakfast." Madison sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping in her dress. "Where am I? What time is it?" "You're in Mr. Blackwood's estate, about an hour outside Richmond. It's nearly 9 o'clock. Elena set the tray on a small table near the window. "Mr. Blackwood will see you at 10. I thought you might like to freshen up first." Madison looked at the breakfast tray, fresh fruit, scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee that smelled infinitely better than anything she'd had in months. Despite her circumstances, her stomach growled audibly. "Elena," Madison said carefully, "what kind of man is Mr. Blackwood? What does he want from me?" Elena's expression was unreadable. "He's not what you're expecting, Miss Rivers. That's all I can say. Eat your breakfast, and I'll show you to a bathroom where you can wash up." The bathroom was luxurious beyond anything Madison had ever seen. Marble countertops, a rainfall shower, and towels so thick and soft they felt like clouds. She stared at herself in the ornate mirror, hardly recognizing the frightened young woman looking back at her. Her auburn hair was tangled, her makeup smeared, and her eyes had a hollow look that spoke of trauma too fresh to process. Madison splashed cold water on her face and tried to steel herself for whatever was coming. She had always prided herself on being strong and resourceful, but the events of the last 24 hours had shattered her sense of control over her own life. Still, she was determined not to show weakness to her captor. Whatever Mr. Blackwood wanted from her, she would face it with as much dignity as she could muster. Eleanor returned with a simple but elegant navy blue dress and matching shoes. Mr. Blackwood thought you might prefer to change clothes before your meeting. How thoughtful of him, Madison replied with bitter sarcasm. Does he dress all his purchases personally? Elena's face softened with what looked like sympathy. Please, Miss Rivers, give him a chance to explain. Things are not always what they seem. The estate's interior was breathtaking. Soaring ceilings, priceless artwork, and furniture that belonged in a museum. But Madison barely noticed the opulence. Her attention was focused on memorizing the layout, looking for potential escape routes, and trying to gauge how many people worked in the household. Elena led her through a series of corridors, to a spacious office-lined floor-to-ceiling with books. Behind an enormous mahogany desk sat a man who looked nothing like what Madison had expected. Mr. Blackwood appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair and intelligent hazel eyes. He was handsome in a refined way, but his most striking feature was the intensity of his gaze, as if he could see straight through to her soul. He stood when she entered, which surprised her. Miss Rivers, please sit down. His voice was the same one she had heard at the auction, but without the shadows and distance, she could detect a slight British accent. I imagine you have many questions. Madison remained standing, her chin raised defiantly. I have one question. What do you want from me? That's complicated, Mr. Blackwood replied, gesturing again to the chair across from his desk. Please sit. This conversation may take some time. Reluctantly, Madison sat down, but she kept her posture rigid and alert. Are you going to tell me your real name, or should I keep calling you Mr. Blackwood? A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. My name is Alexander Blackwood. It's quite real, I assure you. And what do you do for a living, Mr. Blackwood? Besides buying human beings at underground auctions? Alexander's expression grew serious. I'm an investigative journalist, Miss Rivers. I specialize in exposing human trafficking operations. Madison stared at him in disbelief. That's impossible. If you're a journalist, why did you just participate in exactly the kind of crime you claim to fight? Because sometimes the only way to destroy a system is from the inside. Alexander opened a laptop on his desk and turned it toward Madison. The screen showed surveillance footage from the auction, multiple camera angles capturing every face, every transaction, every incriminating word. Madison's mind raced as she tried to process this information. You're saying last night was some kind of sting operation? Not exactly. Torino's operation is too sophisticated for traditional law enforcement to penetrate. He has police on his payroll, judges in his pocket, and politicians who look the other way, but he's also arrogant, and arrogance leads to mistakes. Alexander stood and walked to the window, looking out over the estate's manicured gardens. I've been investigating Torino for 2 years, building a case that will not only destroy his organization, but expose everyone who enables it. Last night's auction gave me evidence that will put dozens of powerful men in prison. So what happens to me? Madison asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander turned back to face her. That depends on what you want to happen. Madison felt a spark of anger flare in her chest. What I want is to go home to my mother and my life. What I want is for none of this to have ever happened. I understand your anger, and you have every right to it. But going home immediately would raise questions that could compromise the investigation. Torino's men are watching your family, making sure you don't resurface too quickly. The mention of her family sent a chill through Madison. Are they in danger? Not if we handle this correctly. As far as Torino knows, you've been sold to a wealthy recluse who keeps his acquisitions isolated. That gives us time to build our case without putting your family at risk. Madison stood abruptly, beginning to pace the length of the office. "This is insane. You paid $150,000 just to maintain your cover." "The money wasn't real," Alexander admitted. "Torino thinks it was wired from an offshore account, but it's actually part of an FBI operation. The account will disappear, along with the rest of his assets when we move against him." "Your FBI?" Madison stopped pacing and stared at him. "Not officially. I'm a civilian contractor working with federal agents who can't infiltrate Torino's circle themselves. My background and resources make me an ideal undercover operative." Madison sank back into the chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. "How long would I have to stay here?" "We estimate another 4 to 6 weeks to gather enough evidence for indictments. During that time, you'd be safe here, and your family would remain protected." "And after that," Alexander's expression grew more uncertain, "after that, you'd likely be called to testify in federal court. Torino and his associates would go to prison, and you'd be free to return to your life." Madison was quiet for a long moment, processing everything Alexander had told her. The revelation that her purchaser was actually trying to help victims of trafficking should have been a relief, but she still felt trapped and powerless. "What if I refuse to cooperate?" she asked finally. "Then I'll arrange for you to return home." "Immediately," Alexander replied without hesitation, "but Torino will assume you escaped, which puts both you and your family in danger. He has a long reach and a longer memory." Madison felt tears of frustration building behind her eyes. Even in this supposedly better scenario, she had no real choices. She could stay and help with an investigation that might save other women from her fate, or she could go home and endanger everyone she loved. "What would I do here for 6 weeks?" she asked. "Whatever you want," Alexander said. "The estate has an extensive library, gardens, a pool, horses if you ride. Elena can arrange for any books or materials you might need. You'd essentially be on a very luxurious house arrest." Madison thought about her mother, who would be confused and frightened by her absence. She thought about the library patrons who depended on her, and the literacy students who would wonder why she'd abandoned them. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her like a physical force. "There's something else," Alexander said gently. "Something I haven't told you yet." Madison looked up at him warily. "What?" "Your father's debt to Torino wasn't the result of bad luck at poker. Torino has been deliberately targeting vulnerable families for years, using debt as a weapon to acquire young women for his operation. Your father was chosen specifically because he had a daughter who fit Torino's preferred demographics." The revelation hit Madison like a physical blow. "You're saying this was planned? That my father was set up?" "I'm saying your father's gambling. Addiction made him an easy mark. But Torino identified your family months ago. He arranged for your father to be invited to high-stakes games he couldn't afford, extended his credit he couldn't repay, and then manipulated the situation to acquire you." Madison felt a complex mix of emotions. Rage at Torino for his manipulation, pity for her father's weakness, and a strange sense of relief that Robert's betrayal wasn't entirely his own choice. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge that dozens of other families had probably suffered the same fate. "How many other women has he taken this way?" Madison asked. "We estimate at least 40 over the past 3 years. Most of them were sold to clients outside the country. You're one of the few we've been able to track down." The scope of Torino's operation was staggering. Madison realized that her own trauma was just one small part of a vast criminal enterprise that had destroyed countless lives. The thought of other young women suffering the same fate filled her with a fierce determination to see justice done. "If I help you," Madison said slowly, "what exactly would you need from me?" Alexander's expression grew hopeful. "Primarily, your testimony about the auction and your experiences, but also, if you're willing, you could help us identify other victims and gather information about Torino's network. Madison was quiet for several minutes, weighing her options. Staying meant prolonged separation from her family and the risk of psychological trauma from remaining in a controlled environment. But going home meant endangering her loved ones and allowing Torino to continue victimizing other families. "I'll stay," she said finally, "but I have conditions. Name them. I want daily updates about my mother's condition. I want to know that she's being properly cared for." "Done. I want access to a secure phone line so I can call my friend Jessica. She's a nurse, and she can check on my mother without raising suspicions." "Agreed. And I want to be actively involved in the investigation, not just hidden away like a protected witness. If I'm going to sacrifice 6 weeks of my life for this, I want to make sure it counts." Alexander smiled for the first time since their conversation. "Began. That can definitely be arranged. In fact, your insights as a victim could be invaluable in understanding how Torino's operation really works." Madison stood up, feeling more in control than she had since her ordeal began. "Then let's get started, Mr. Blackwood. I want to help you destroy this monster." As she spoke those words, Madison felt something shift inside her. The frightened, helpless victim was being replaced by a woman with a mission. She would turn her trauma into a weapon against the man who had tried to destroy her life and the lives of so many others. Her imprisonment would become her opportunity to fight back, in ways she never could have imagined. 3 weeks into Madison's stay at the Blackwood estate, their working relationship had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. What began as a purely professional collaboration between investigator and witness had gradually transformed into a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Madison had thrown herself into the investigation with an intensity that surprised even Alexander. She spent hours each day reviewing surveillance footage, identifying patterns in Torino's operation, and helping to decode the complex network of buyers, sellers, and enablers that made human trafficking possible. Her background as a librarian had given her exceptional research skills, and her personal experience as a victim provided insights that no outside investigator could match. "Look at this," Madison said one morning, spreading several photographs across Alexander's desk. They had been working together in his office since dawn, analyzing financial records that the FBI had obtained through subpoenas. "Every single one of these buyers has donated to Senator Richardson's campaign. That can't be a coincidence." Alexander studied the photographs, headshots of men from the auction, cross-referenced with campaign contribution records. Madison was right. The pattern was too obvious to ignore. "Richardson chairs the Senate Subcommittee on Organized Crime," Alexander mused. "If Torino has him in his pocket, it explains how the operation has avoided federal prosecution for so long." Madison had become adept at connecting seemingly unrelated pieces of information, turning scattered evidence into a coherent picture of corruption that reached far beyond Torino's warehouse. Her analytical mind, trained through years of helping library patrons navigate complex research projects, proved invaluable in understanding the scope of the criminal enterprise. But the investigation was taking an emotional toll on both of them. Madison frequently had nightmares about the auction, waking up in cold sweats as she relieved the horror of being evaluated like livestock. Alexander carried his own burden of guilt, watching Madison struggle with trauma that his investigation had failed to prevent. One evening, as they worked late reviewing testimony from other trafficking victims, Madison suddenly broke down. She had been reading the statement of a 17-year-old girl who had been sold to pay her stepfather's drug debts, and the similarities to her own story were overwhelming. "She was the same age I was when I started college," Madison sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "She should be worried about homework and boys, not this." Alexander felt helpless watching Madison's pain. Over the past 3 weeks, he had come to admire her strength, her intelligence, and her fierce determination. To seek justice, But moments like this reminded him that beneath her professional composure was a young woman processing unimaginable trauma. Without thinking, Alexander moved around the desk and placed a gentle hand on Madison's shoulder. "We're going to stop him, Madison. Because of your work, because of your courage. We're going to make sure this never happens to another family." Madison looked up at him through her tears, seeing something in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before. Behind his professional demeanor and upper-class British reserve, Alexander Blackwood was a man carrying his own deep wounds. "Why do you do this work?" Madison asked quietly. "I mean, really, why dedicate your life to fighting trafficking?" Alexander's hand moved away from her shoulder, and for a moment Madison thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he sat down in the chair beside her, instead of returning to his position behind the desk. "My sister," he said simply. "Her name was Charlotte. She was 18 when she disappeared during a gap-year trip to Eastern Europe. For 2 years, my family searched for her, hired investigators, and pressured the British government to intervene. We never found her." Madison felt her heart clench with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Alexander. We eventually learned that she had been taken by traffickers, sold into a network that moved girls across multiple countries. By the time we had any leads, the trail was years cold." Alexander's voice remained steady, but Madison could see the pain in his eyes. "I became a journalist to have the resources and credentials to investigate these networks. Every case I work, every victim I help find, I'm hoping it will lead me to information about Charlotte." "Have you found anything? Any trace of her?" Alexander shook his head. "Nothing concrete, but I've learned that these networks are vast and interconnected. Stopping Torino might save other girls, but it might also provide leads to other operations. Of the traffickers who might have encountered Charlotte, the revelation created a new understanding between them. They were both victims of trafficking in different ways. Madison directly, Alexander through the loss of his sister. Their shared pain had forged a bond that went beyond professional collaboration. "Tell me about her," Madison said softly. "About Charlotte." Alexander's face softened as he spoke about his sister. Charlotte had been brilliant and adventurous, passionate about art history, and determined to travel the world before starting university. She had been accepted to Oxford to study medieval manuscripts, but she wanted to spend a year exploring European museums and historical sites first. "She had this laugh," Alexander said, smiling at the memory. "It was completely infectious. She could make anyone laugh, even our stern headmaster at school, and she was fearless, absolutely fearless. She would try anything once, talk to anyone, go anywhere that seemed interesting." Madison listened as Alexander described family holidays, Charlotte's artwork, and her dreams of becoming a museum curator. She could see how much Alexander had loved his sister, and how her disappearance had fundamentally changed the trajectory of his life. "She would have liked you," Alexander said suddenly. "Charlotte always gravitated towards strong, intelligent women. She said they were the ones who changed the world." Madison felt a warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. Over the past 3 weeks, she had begun to see Alexander as more than just the man who had rescued her from the auction. He was brilliant, dedicated, and surprisingly vulnerable beneath his composed exterior. "What about you?" Alexander asked. "Tell me about your life before all this happened. What were your dreams?" Madison found herself opening up about aspects of her life she rarely shared with anyone. She talked about her love of books and learning, her dreams of traveling to see the great libraries of the world, and her secret fantasy of writing novels that would inspire others the way books had always inspired her. "I used to write stories when I was younger," Madison admitted. Nothing serious, just little tales about adventures and romance. But taking care of Mom took over everything, and I convinced myself that writing was a selfish luxury I couldn't afford. It's not selfish to have dreams, Alexander said gently. Your mother wouldn't want you to sacrifice your aspirations for her care. Madison felt tears well up again, but this time they weren't entirely tears of sadness. I haven't thought about my own wants and needs in so long. Everything has been about taking care of other people, solving other people's problems. You're doing that now too, Alexander pointed out, but you're also fighting for something bigger than yourself. That takes incredible courage. As the days passed, Madison and Alexander's evening conversations became a cherished ritual. After long days of investigation work, they would sit in the estate's library or walk through the gardens, sharing stories about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Madison learned that Alexander had attended Cambridge, worked as a war correspondent in Syria, and owned homes in London, New York, and Virginia. But she also discovered that despite his wealth and accomplishments, he was fundamentally lonely, a man who had dedicated his life to seeking justice for others while neglecting his own emotional needs. Alexander, in turn, was amazed by Madison's resilience and wisdom. Despite her young age and small-town background, she possessed an emotional intelligence and strength of character that humbled him. She had been through unspeakable trauma, yet she channeled her pain into determination to help others. Her insights often solved problems that had puzzled him for months. The investigation was progressing rapidly thanks to Madison's contributions. They had identified a network of corruption that included politicians, judges, police officials, and business leaders across 3 states. The evidence they were gathering would result in dozens of arrests and potentially save hundreds of victims. But as their professional partnership deepened, both Madison and Alexander began to struggle with feelings that went beyond mutual respect and shared purpose. Madison found herself looking forward to their conversations with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the investigation. Alexander caught himself watching Madison work with an admiration that was becoming distinctly personal rather than professional. The emotional breakthrough came during a particularly difficult day of reviewing video testimony from trafficking victims. Madison had been transcribing interviews for hours when she came across a recording that stopped her cold. The victim was describing a buyer who matched the description of the man in the blue tie who had bid on Madison at the auction. He made me call him Daddy, the young woman on the video said through tears. He said I reminded him of his own daughter, and that's why he had to have me. Madison felt physically sick as the implications sank in. The respectable-looking businessman who had bid on her was a predator who specifically sought victims who resembled his own child. The perversity of it was almost too much to process. Alexander found Madison in the bathroom an hour later, sitting on the floor and struggling to breathe through a panic attack. Without hesitation, he sat down beside her on the cold marble tiles and guided her through breathing exercises until her breathing stabilized. I can't stop thinking about all the girls who weren't as lucky as me, Madison whispered. All the ones who were sold to men like that, who didn't have someone to rescue them. You're going to help us save them, Alexander said firmly. Because of your work, because of your strength, we're going to shut down this entire network. Madison looked at him through her tears, seeing not just an investigator or a rescuer, but a man who truly understood her pain. How do you do this every day? How do you carry all this knowledge about human suffering and still function? Alexander was quiet for a long moment. I think about Charlotte. I imagine that somewhere, someone like you is fighting to help her, to bring her home. And I think about all the girls we've saved, all the families we've reunited. The darkness is real, Madison, but so is the light. In that moment, sitting on a bathroom floor in the aftermath of a panic attack, Madison realized that she had fallen in love with Alexander Blackwood. Not because he had rescued her, not because he was wealthy and handsome, but because he was a man who had turned his own pain into a mission to help others. He was brilliant and brave and broken, just like she was, and together they were building something beautiful from the wreckage of their trauma. Alexander was having his own realization. Watching Madison's courage over the past 3 weeks, seeing her transform from victim to warrior, had awakened feelings he thought he had buried with Charlotte's disappearance. Madison wasn't just helping him with an investigation, she was healing parts of his soul that he hadn't even realized were wounded. But both of them knew that their situation was impossibly complicated. Madison was technically still a trafficking victim under federal protection. Alexander was her protector and investigator. Any romantic relationship between them would be ethically questionable at best, legally problematic at worst. That evening, as they worked together in Alexander's office, the tension between them was palpable. Every accidental touch, every shared glance, every moment of laughter carried an undercurrent of longing that neither dared to acknowledge directly. "Madison," Alexander said finally, setting down the documents he had been pretending to read, "we need to talk about what's happening between us." Madison's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean, this connection we've developed, these feelings." Alexander ran his hands through his dark hair. A gesture Madison had learned indicated he was struggling with a difficult decision. "It's not appropriate given our circumstances." Madison felt a stab of disappointment, followed quickly by defensive anger. "So you're saying this is all in my head, that I'm just confused because you rescued me?" "No," Alexander said quickly. "I'm saying that I care about you far more than I should, and I don't want to take advantage of a vulnerable situation." Madison stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I am not a vulnerable victim anymore, Alexander. I'm a grown woman who has been working beside you as an equal partner for 3 weeks. I'm capable of knowing my own feelings." "Madison, don't you dare patronize me," Madison interrupted, her voice rising with passion. "I've been making my own decisions about my life since I was 18 years old. I chose to stay here and help with this investigation. I chose to work with you every day despite my trauma, and I'm choosing to tell you that I have feelings for you that have nothing to do with gratitude or Stockholm Syndrome or whatever psychological explanation you're trying to apply." Alexander stared at her, seeing not the frightened young woman who had been brought to his estate 3 weeks ago, but a fierce, intelligent, beautiful woman who was absolutely right about her own agency and autonomy. "I love you," Madison said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I love your dedication to justice, your brilliance, your gentleness with victims, and your strength in the face of impossible odds. I love that you turned your pain into purpose, and that you've helped me do the same." Alexander felt his carefully constructed emotional walls crumbling. "I love you too," he admitted. "But Madison, even if the circumstances were different, you're going to testify in federal court in a few weeks. After that, you'll be free to go home, to rebuild your life, to pursue your dreams. I don't want you to feel obligated to me because of this investigation." Madison stepped closer to him, her green eyes blazing with determination. "Alexander Blackwood, you brilliant, stubborn man, don't you understand that you've become part of my dreams?" The federal courthouse in Richmond buzzed with activity as the largest human trafficking prosecution in Virginia's history reached its climax. After 6 weeks of investigation, the evidence that Madison and Alexander had compiled resulted in a sweeping indictment that brought down not only Vincent Torino, but an entire network of corruption spanning 3 states. Madison stood in the witness preparation room, adjusting the navy blue suit that Elena had helped her select for her testimony. Through the window, she could see protesters holding signs demanding justice for trafficking victims, while news vans lined the street. The case had attracted national attention, bringing unprecedented scrutiny to the underground world of human trafficking. "Are you ready for this?" Alexander asked, entering the room with FBI agent Sarah Chen, who had been coordinating the federal investigation. Madison nodded, though her stomach was churning with nerves. "As ready as I'll ever be. How many defendants are we up to now?" 43, Agent Chen replied, consulting her tablet. "Torino, his entire operation, Senator Richardson, Judge Morrison, 6 police officials, and 28 buyers from various auctions. Your testimony is the cornerstone that ties everything together." Over the past 6 weeks, Madison's partnership with Alexander had yielded evidence that none of them had initially thought possible. Her insights into victim psychology had helped them understand how traffickers selected and groomed their targets. Her research skills had uncovered financial connections between seemingly unrelated criminals. Most importantly, her courage in reviewing hundreds of hours of surveillance footage had identified victims and perpetrators across multiple cases. The investigation had also revealed the staggering scope of Torino's operation. Beyond the auction house, he controlled a network of fake modeling agencies, bogus job placement services, and fraudulent romance websites that lured vulnerable women into trafficking situations. The evidence suggested that over 300 women had been victimized over a 5-year period. But the most shocking revelation had come just 1 week earlier, when Madison recognized a face in an old surveillance video that changed everything. "Alexander," Madison had called out from her workstation in his office, her voice tight with excitement. "I need you to see this." The footage was from a trafficking operation in Prague, obtained through an international law enforcement exchange. In the background of a scene showing women being transported, Madison had spotted a young woman with dark hair and familiar features. "That's her," Alexander had whispered, his face going pale. "That's Charlotte." The video was 2 years old, but it proved that Charlotte was alive and provided the first concrete lead in Alexander's search for his sister. Within hours, Alexander had contacted his European law enforcement contacts and arranged for a coordinated operation to track down the Prague network. Now, as Madison prepared to testify, she knew that her courage in this courtroom could lead not only to justice for Torino's victims, but potentially to reuniting Alexander with his sister. The courtroom was packed as Madison took the witness stand. Torino sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit and composed demeanor a stark contrast to the monster she had seen at the warehouse. But Madison felt no fear as she faced him. Over the past 6 weeks, she had transformed from victim to survivor to warrior, and today she would use her voice to ensure that he could never hurt anyone again. "Miss Rivers," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court about the evening of October 15th when you were brought to Mr. Torino's warehouse." Madison's testimony was clear, detailed, and devastating. She described the auction with clinical precision, identifying buyers, documenting the systematic dehumanization of victims, and explaining how Torino's operation preyed on vulnerable families. Her composure never wavered, even during aggressive cross-examination by defense attorneys who tried to discredit her account. "You claim my client threatened your family," Torino's lawyer said during cross-examination. "But isn't it true that you voluntarily accompanied your father to the warehouse?" Madison's green eyes flashed with steel. "I accompanied my father because I trusted him. I had no idea he was delivering me to a human trafficking auction. The betrayal doesn't make the crime any less real." When the defense attorney suggested that Madison had fabricated details to seek revenge against Torino, her response silenced the courtroom. "Sir, I didn't need to fabricate anything. Mr. Torino's crimes speak for themselves. The surveillance footage, The financial records, the testimony of other victims, it all corroborates exactly what I experienced. The truth is powerful enough without embellishment. After 3 days of testimony from Madison and other victims, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Torino was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Senator Richardson received 25 years for corruption and conspiracy. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 5 to 30 years. But for Madison, the most meaningful moment came when she testified about the systematic nature of Torino's operation and how it could be dismantled. Trafficking networks survive because they exploit vulnerabilities, poverty, addiction, desperation, Madison told the court. The solution isn't just prosecuting traffickers after the fact. We need to address the underlying conditions that make families vulnerable to exploitation. We need better addiction treatment, financial assistance programs, and education about how these predators operate. Her recommendations were incorporated into the judge's final ruling, which mandated the creation of a victim services fund financed by the seizure of Torino's assets. The fund would provide support for trafficking survivors and fund prevention programs in vulnerable communities. As they left the courthouse after the sentencing, Madison felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Justice had been served, but more importantly, she had reclaimed her agency and used her experience to protect others. "I'm proud of you," Alexander said as they walked toward his car. "What you did in there was extraordinary." Madison smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "We did it together, all of it." That evening, back at the estate, they received the call they had been waiting for. Alexander's European contacts had successfully raided the Prague operation, and Charlotte had been found alive. She was in a hospital recovering from her ordeal, but she was safe and asking for her brother. Alexander broke down completely when he received the news, years of suppressed grief and hope finally overwhelming his composure. Madison held him as he sobbed, understanding that his tears were for both joy at Charlotte's rescue and sorrow for the years of suffering she had endured. "She's alive," Alexander whispered against Madison's shoulder. "After all this time, she's alive." "She's alive because you never stopped looking," Madison replied, "because you turned your pain into purpose and saved countless people along the way." 3 days later, Madison accompanied Alexander to London to reunite with Charlotte. The young woman who had been 18 when she disappeared was now 23, bearing the invisible scars of 5 years of captivity. But her spirit was unbroken, and her reunion with Alexander was one of the most beautiful things Madison had ever witnessed. Charlotte was thin and quiet, but her eyes held the same intelligence and strength that Madison had come to love in Alexander. During their first conversation, Charlotte surprised Madison by taking her hand. "Alex told me what you did," Charlotte said softly. "How you helped him find me. How you turned your own trauma into justice for others." "Thank you." Madison felt tears well up in her eyes. "We helped each other. That's what survivors do." As Charlotte began her recovery process, Madison faced her own choice about the future. The investigation was complete, the trials were over, and she was free to return to her life in Millbrook. But the question remained. What kind of life did she want to build? Her mother's condition had stabilized under the excellent care that Alexander had arranged. Caroline was in a specialized memory care facility that provided round-the-clock medical supervision while maintaining a home-like environment. Robert had entered treatment for his gambling addiction and was slowly rebuilding his relationship with his family. Jessica visited Caroline regularly and kept Madison updated on her progress. Madison could return to her job at the library, resume her quiet life in Millbrook, and try to pretend that the past 2 months had never happened. Or she could embrace the person she had become through her trials, and build something entirely new? The answer came to her during a walk through Alexander's estate gardens, where she had spent so many hours processing her trauma and planning for justice. She realized that she had discovered her true calling, not just as a librarian or a survivor, but as an advocate for trafficking victims and a fighter against the systems that enabled their exploitation. "I want to start a foundation," Madison told Alexander that evening as they sat in his library, "using my share of the Victim Services Fund as seed money, something that provides comprehensive support for trafficking survivors, legal aid, counseling, job training, housing assistance." Alexander's face lit up with admiration. "That's a brilliant idea. You'd be perfectly positioned to understand what survivors really need." "I'd want you to help me," Madison continued. "Your investigative skills, your resources, your connections. We could work together to identify trafficking operations before they destroy more lives." Alexander reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. "Madison Rivers, are you asking me to be your partner, in work and in life?" Madison felt her heart race as she looked into his hazel eyes. "I'm asking if you want to build something beautiful together, something that honors Charlotte's survival and the courage of every victim who has fought back against their captors." Alexander's response was to pull her into his arms and kiss her with all the love and admiration he had been holding back for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and laughing. "Is that a yes?" Madison asked. "That's a yes to everything," Alexander replied. "To the foundation, to the partnership, to spending my life with the most extraordinary woman I've ever met." 6 months later, the Madison Rivers Foundation for Trafficking Survivors opened its doors in a renovated building in downtown Richmond. The organization provided comprehensive services for survivors while funding investigative efforts to identify and shut down trafficking operations. Madison served as executive director, while Alexander handled investigations and international outreach. Their first major success came when they identified a trafficking ring operating out of college campuses, using fake study abroad programs to lure students into captivity. The investigation, led by Madison's insights into how traffickers exploited trust relationships, resulted in the rescue of 37 young women and the arrest of the entire network. Charlotte, now fully recovered and enrolled in graduate school for social work, served on the Foundation's board of directors. Her perspective as a long-term trafficking survivor provided invaluable guidance for the organization's programs. She had also become close friends with Madison, seeing in her the sister she had always wanted. Caroline's condition had stabilized remarkably well in her new care facility. While her dementia continued to progress, she had good days when she recognized Madison and expressed pride in her daughter's important work. Madison visited weekly, often bringing books to read aloud and sharing stories about the lives they were changing through the foundation. Robert had completed his treatment program and was working to rebuild trust with his family. He volunteered with the Foundation's prevention programs, sharing his story with other families to help them recognize the warning signs of trafficking recruitment. His testimony about how easily he had been manipulated helped save other vulnerable fathers from making similar mistakes. On a crisp autumn evening, exactly 1 year after the night she had been taken to the warehouse auction, Madison stood in the Foundation's main conference room, looking at a wall covered with photographs of survivors they had helped. Each face represented a life reclaimed, a family reunited, a future restored. Alexander entered the room carrying 2 cups of coffee, a ritual they had maintained since their early days working together on the investigation. But now their partnership was grounded in love and shared purpose rather than crisis and survival. "The Prague team called," Alexander said, handing Madison her coffee. "They've identified the entire network that was holding Charlotte. 12 more operations shut down, 43 more survivors freed." Madison smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from turning their pain into purpose. "Every time we save someone, every time we shut down one of these operations, it feels like we're healing a little more of the damage they tried to do to us." Alexander nodded, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they looked at the photographs together. "You know what I realized today?" "What?" "Torino thought he was buying and selling people, but what he actually did was create an army of survivors who refused to let anyone else suffer the way we did. He made us stronger than he ever imagined possible." Madison leaned back against Alexander's chest, feeling completely at peace for the first time since her ordeal began. "He tried to break us, but instead he forged us into something unbreakable." As they stood together in their foundation's offices, surrounded by the evidence of lives saved and futures restored, Madison realized that her story wasn't really about being sold to pay her father's gambling debt. It was about refusing to let trauma define her, choosing love over fear, and transforming the worst experience of her life into a mission that would protect countless others. She had been reborn, not through the auction that tried to reduce her to property, but through her choice to reclaim her power and use it to light the way for others trapped in darkness. And with Alexander beside her, sharing the same mission and the same love, she knew that together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their love story had begun in the depths of human cruelty, but it had blossomed into something beautiful and unstoppable. A partnership that would spend a lifetime turning pain into purpose and ensuring that no other family would suffer as theirs had. 2 years after the Foundation's launch, Madison found herself standing before the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, delivering a keynote address on innovative approaches to combating human trafficking. The girl who had once dreamed of traveling to see the great libraries of the world was now addressing world leaders about one of humanity's most pressing issues. "Survivors are not broken people who need to be fixed," Madison told the assembly, her voice carrying clearly through the vast hall. "We are experts who understand these criminal networks in ways that traditional law enforcement cannot. When you include survivors in designing anti-trafficking strategies, you create solutions that actually work." Alexander watched from the audience, his heart swelling with pride as Madison commanded the attention of diplomats, activists, and government officials from around the globe. She had become one of the most respected voices in the anti-trafficking movement, sought after by governments and organizations worldwide for her unique insights. The Foundation had grown beyond their wildest expectations. What started as a local Richmond organization now operated in 12 countries, with satellite offices staffed by survivors who had been trained in investigation techniques, victim services, and policy advocacy. Their model of survivor-led programming had been adopted by organizations worldwide, fundamentally changing how the international community approached trafficking prevention and response. Charlotte had completed her master's degree in social work and now served as the Foundation's Director of International Programs. Her experience as a long-term trafficking survivor gave her credibility with victims that no amount of academic training could provide. She had also become a powerful speaker, in her own right, addressing university audiences about the realities of trafficking and the importance of prevention education. "My brother likes to say that traffickers created their own worst enemy when they took me," Charlotte had said during a recent speech at Harvard Law School, "because survivors who escape don't just want their own freedom. We want to tear down the entire system that stole years of our lives." The Foundation's investigation unit, led by Alexander, had developed revolutionary techniques for identifying trafficking operations before they could fully establish themselves. By analyzing financial patterns, social media activity, and recruitment strategies, they could often predict where traffickers would strike next and alert local authorities to intervene before victims were taken. Their most celebrated success had come 18 months earlier, when they identified a trafficking ring that was targeting refugee families at border crossings. The operation, which they codenamed Safe Harbor, resulted in the arrest of 87 traffickers across 7 countries and the prevention of hundreds of potential kidnappings. Madison's personal life had found its own beautiful rhythm alongside her professional achievements. She and Alexander had married in a small ceremony at the estate, surrounded by trafficking survivors they had helped, law enforcement partners who had become friends, and family members who had supported their journey. Caroline had been lucid, enough on the wedding day to give Madison her blessing, telling her that she had always known her daughter was destined for extraordinary things. The wedding itself became a symbol of triumph over trauma. Instead of traditional wedding favors, Madison and Alexander made donations to anti-trafficking organizations in each guest's name. Charlotte served as matron of honor, and several survivors from their first cases participated in the ceremony as bridesmaids and groomsmen. Even Robert, who had continued his recovery journey and now worked full-time for the Foundation's prevention programs, walked Madison down the aisle with tears of pride streaming down his face. Their honeymoon had been spent establishing the Foundation's European headquarters in London, allowing them to be closer to Charlotte while expanding their international reach. They had purchased a historic townhouse in Kensington that served as both their residence and a safe house for trafficking survivors awaiting trial testimony or long-term placement. Madison had also fulfilled her long-deferred dream of writing, though not in the way she had originally imagined. Her memoir, The Price of Freedom, A Survivor's Journey from Victim to Victory, had become a bestseller and required reading in criminal justice programs across the country. The book's proceeds funded scholarships for trafficking survivors pursuing higher education. But perhaps her most meaningful writing project was the children's book she had co-authored with Charlotte, called Finding Your Voice. Written for young people who had experienced trauma, the book used simple language and beautiful illustrations to teach children that their experiences didn't define their worth and that they had the power to help others heal. The Foundation's prevention programs had evolved into comprehensive community initiatives that addressed the root causes of trafficking vulnerability. They provided financial literacy education to prevent families from falling into debt traps, addiction counseling to help parents avoid the destructive choices that Robert had made, and job training programs for at-risk youth who might otherwise be recruited by traffickers. Madison had also spearheaded the creation of a unique partnership between the Foundation and major technology companies to develop artificial intelligence tools that could identify trafficking-related content online. The algorithms they created had helped law enforcement agencies around the world identify and shut down thousands of illegal websites and social media accounts used for trafficking recruitment and coordination. One of Madison's proudest achievements was the Foundation's legal advocacy program, which provided pro bono representation for trafficking survivors in civil cases against their captors. The program had recovered over $50 million in damages for survivors, money that funded their education, therapy, and reintegration into society. The program also worked to change laws that treated trafficking victims as criminals rather than survivors. Madison's testimony before congressional committees had been instrumental in passing federal legislation that provided automatic expungement of criminal records for trafficking victims who had been forced to commit crimes while in captivity. Alexander's investigative work had evolved beyond individual cases to focus on systemic issues that enabled trafficking networks to operate. His exposés of corruption in government agencies, banks that facilitated money laundering for traffickers, and corporations that unknowingly used trafficked labor had led to industry-wide reforms and new regulations. His most impactful investigation had revealed how certain modeling agencies, talent scouts, and entertainment industry figures had been systematically exploiting young people seeking careers in Hollywood. The resulting congressional hearings and criminal prosecutions had fundamentally changed how the entertainment industry operated, with new safeguards and oversight mechanisms protecting aspiring performers. The couple's personal relationship had deepened and matured alongside their professional partnership. They had learned to balance their intense work with quiet moments of normalcy, cooking dinner together, reading in bed on Sunday mornings, taking long walks through the gardens where they had first fallen in love. They had also faced challenges that tested their bond. Madison had struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder for years after her captivity, experiencing panic attacks and nightmares that sometimes made normal life difficult. Alexander had supported her through therapy, medication adjustments, and the slow process of healing from trauma. Alexander had his own difficulties processing Charlotte's recovery and the guilt he felt over not finding her sooner. He had undergone counseling to address his tendency to blame himself for things beyond his control and to learn healthy ways of channeling his protective instincts. Together, they had learned that love wasn't just about the grand romantic gestures, but about showing up for each other during the difficult moments when trauma reared its head or when the weight of their work threatened to overwhelm them. 3 years after their marriage, Madison and Alexander made the decision to start a family. The choice was complicated by Madison's trauma history and concerns about how pregnancy and childbirth might affect her psychological well-being. But with the support of specialized therapists and medical professionals who understood trafficking, survivors' unique needs, Madison successfully carried and delivered a healthy daughter they named Hope. Hope Rivers Blackwood became the light of their lives and a symbol of their triumph over the forces that had tried to destroy them. She was a happy, curious child who seemed to inherit both Madison's intelligence and Alexander's determination. Even as a toddler, she would sit quietly in foundation meetings, seeming to understand that her parents' work was important. The foundation's work continued to expand as Hope grew. They had established a residential treatment facility for trafficking survivors who needed long-term care, a job training center that helped survivors develop marketable skills, and a research institute that studied trafficking patterns and developed evidence-based prevention strategies. Madison had also returned to school, earning a law degree through night classes while continuing to run the foundation during the day. She had been admitted to the Virginia bar and now argued cases on behalf of trafficking survivors in federal courts across the country. Her legal work had focused particularly on holding corporations accountable when they profited from trafficked labor. Several major retailers had been forced to pay substantial settlements and change their supply chain practices after Madison's legal team proved they had knowingly purchased goods made by trafficking victims. On the 5th anniversary of Torino's conviction, Madison stood once again in a courtroom, but this time as a lawyer rather than a victim. She was arguing before the Supreme Court in a case that would determine whether trafficking survivors could sue their captors in federal court, even if the trafficking occurred entirely within one state. "Your Honors," Madison said, addressing the 9 justices with the same composure she had shown during her original testimony, "human trafficking is inherently a federal crime because it represents an attack on the fundamental human rights that our Constitution guarantees to all people within our borders. When traffickers reduce human beings to property, they violate principles that transcend state boundaries. The court ultimately ruled in favor of trafficking survivors, opening new avenues for justice and compensation that had previously been blocked by jurisdictional limitations. Legal experts hailed Madison's argument as a masterpiece of constitutional interpretation that would benefit trafficking survivors for generations to come. As she left the Supreme Court building that day, Madison reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from a small-town librarian to a nationally recognized advocate arguing before the highest court in the land. Every challenge had made her stronger. Every victory had opened new possibilities for helping others. Alexander was waiting for her on the courthouse steps with Hope, now a precocious 5-year-old who had accompanied them to Washington. As they walked toward their car, Hope tugged on Madison's hand. "Mommy, did you win?" Hope asked with the directness that only children possess. Madison smiled, lifting her daughter into her arms. "We all won today, sweetheart. Every person who has ever been hurt the way Mommy and Aunt Charlotte were hurt, they all won today." That evening, as they sat in their hotel room overlooking the Potomac River, Madison and Alexander planned their next initiatives. The foundation was launching a new program to train law enforcement officers in trauma-informed interview techniques for trafficking victims. They were also developing a mobile app that would allow potential victims to discreetly alert authorities if they found themselves in dangerous situations. But perhaps most importantly, they were working on establishing a residential school for children who had been rescued from trafficking situations. Too many young survivors were falling through the cracks of traditional educational and social service systems, and Madison was determined to create a place where they could heal while receiving the education and support they needed to build successful lives. "Sometimes I think about that night in the warehouse," Madison said as she tucked Hope into bed. How terrified I was, how certain I was that my life was over." Alexander took her hand, their wedding rings catching the light from Hope's nightlight. "What do you think about it? How wrong I was about everything ending. How that night wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of the most important chapter. How the worst thing that ever happened to me led me to the most meaningful work I could ever do, and to a love I never could have imagined." Madison looked at their sleeping daughter, at the successful man who had become her partner in every sense of the word, at the life they had built from the ashes of trauma and injustice. She thought about the hundreds of survivors they had helped, the thousands of victims they had prevented, and the systemic changes they had achieved. Vincent Torino had tried to reduce her to a commodity, a transaction, a debt payment. Instead, he had created his own worst nightmare, a survivor who refused to be silenced, who turned her pain into power, and who would spend her lifetime making sure that his brand of evil never again went unopposed. As Madison drifted off to sleep that night, she smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help survivors find their voices, and new ways to turn the world's darkest corners into places where hope could flourish. Her story had begun with betrayal and terror, but it had become a testament to the power of human resilience, the transformative nature of love, and the unbreakable determination of those who refused to let evil have the final word. 7 years had passed since that fateful night at Torino's warehouse, and the Madison Rivers Foundation had become a global force for change. Their headquarters in Richmond had expanded to occupy an entire city block, housing not just administrative offices, but also a state-of-the-art training facility for law enforcement, a therapeutic center for survivors, and a research institute that was pioneering new approaches to trauma recovery. Madison's influence extended far beyond the Foundation's walls. She had been appointed to serve on the President's Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, where her survivor perspective shaped national policy. Her recommendations had led to the creation of specialized trafficking courts, increased funding for survivor services, and mandatory trafficking awareness training for healthcare workers, teachers, and social service professionals. The technological innovations developed by the Foundation had revolutionized law enforcement's ability to combat trafficking. Their artificial intelligence system, nicknamed Sentinel, could analyze millions of online communications in real time, identifying potential trafficking situations with 93% accuracy. Police departments in 48 states now used Sentinel to rescue victims and arrest traffickers before crimes escalated. Alexander's investigative journalism had evolved into a multimedia empire dedicated to exposing human rights abuses worldwide. His documentary series Hidden Chains had won 3 Emmy Awards and brought international attention to trafficking operations in regions where traditional media feared to investigate. His most recent film, focusing on trafficking in the seafood industry, had led to congressional hearings and new regulations that transformed how American companies source their products. The couple's daughter, Hope, had grown into a remarkable 8-year-old who seemed destined to follow in her parents' footsteps. Despite her young age, she had already raised thousands of dollars for the foundation by organizing neighborhood car washes and lemonade stands. Her school presentation about trafficking awareness had been so compelling that the principal invited Madison to speak to the entire district about keeping children safe from predators. Hope's existence had brought unexpected healing to the extended family. Caroline, now residing in a specialized memory care facility that the foundation helped fund, had moments of clarity where she recognized her granddaughter and spoke with pride about Madison's accomplishments. These visits became precious opportunities for 3 generations of strong women to connect across the barriers that dementia had created. Robert's transformation remained one of the most profound examples of redemption within Madison's story. His work with the Foundation's prevention programs had evolved into a nationally recognized model for addiction intervention and family support. He traveled extensively, speaking to parents and community groups about recognizing the warning signs of trafficking recruitment and understanding how desperation could make families vulnerable to exploitation. His relationship with Madison had healed slowly but completely. The trust that Torino had shattered through manipulation and coercion had been rebuilt through years of consistent honesty, genuine remorse, and dedicated service to trafficking prevention. Robert had become not just Madison's father again, but one of her most valued colleagues in the fight against trafficking. Charlotte's recovery journey had taken her in directions none of them could have predicted. After completing her social work degree, she had surprised everyone by announcing her intention to attend medical school. Her goal was to become a psychiatrist specializing in trauma recovery for trafficking survivors, combining her lived experience with advanced clinical training. "I know what it feels like to have your mind broken by captivity," Charlotte had explained during her medical school interviews. "I want to help other survivors rebuild not just their lives, but their ability to trust, to love, and to hope again." Her acceptance to Johns Hopkins Medical School had been celebrated at the Foundation like a family achievement. Charlotte's journey from trafficking victim to future physician represented the ultimate triumph over those who had tried to destroy her potential. The Foundation's educational initiatives had reached millions of people worldwide through innovative online platforms and community partnerships. Their Red Flag Recognition program taught ordinary citizens how to identify potential trafficking situations and report them safely to authorities. The program had been credited with the rescue of over 2,000 victims in its first 3 years of operation. Madison had also pioneered a unique survivor mentorship program that paired newly rescued victims with survivors who had successfully rebuilt their lives. The program's success rate for long-term recovery and reintegration was unprecedented, with 91% of participants achieving educational goals, stable employment, or successful family reunification within 2 years. Her academic pursuits had continued alongside her advocacy work. After completing her law degree, Madison had earned a PhD in criminology, writing her dissertation on the intersection of addiction, poverty, and trafficking vulnerability. Her research had become required reading in universities worldwide and had influenced anti-trafficking strategies in dozens of countries. The personal side of Madison and Alexander's relationship had deepened through shared trials and triumphs. They had weathered Madison's occasional setbacks in trauma recovery, Alexander's struggles with survivor guilt about Charlotte's years in captivity, and the intense pressure of running a high-profile international organization while raising a young child. Their communication had evolved to handle even the most difficult conversations with honesty and compassion. When Madison experienced panic attacks triggered by certain investigation cases, Alexander knew exactly how to provide support without being overprotective. When Alexander became obsessively focused on a particularly challenging trafficking ring, Madison understood how to help him maintain perspective and self-care. They had also learned to celebrate their victories together, whether it was the successful prosecution of a major trafficking ring, the rescue of long-term captivity victims, or Hope's achievements in school and her budding social activism. Their ability to find joy and meaning in both their professional accomplishments and their family life had become a model for other survivor couples. The Foundation's residential school for rescued child trafficking victims had opened 2 years earlier to overwhelming demand. The institution, built on the Foundation's Virginia estate, provided not just education, but comprehensive therapeutic support, life skills training, and preparation for either family reunification or independent living. Many graduates had gone on to attend college, with several specifically choosing to study social work, law enforcement, or other fields that would allow them to help other trafficking survivors. Madison's speaking engagements had taken her to every continent except Antarctica. Her ability to communicate the complex realities of trafficking in language that resonated with diverse audiences had made her one of the most sought-after speakers on human rights issues. Whether addressing the African Union, the European Parliament, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Madison's message remained consistent. Survivors possessed unique insights that were essential for effective anti-trafficking efforts. Her speeches often included specific policy recommendations backed by rigorous research and real-world experience. She had successfully advocated for changes in how trafficking victims were treated in the legal system, how survivors were supported during recovery, and how prevention programs were designed and implemented. The Foundation's research division had published over 200 peer-reviewed articles on trafficking-related topics, fundamentally changing how academics, policymakers, and practitioners understood the crime. Their longitudinal studies of survivor recovery had identified the most effective therapeutic interventions, while their analysis of trafficking recruitment patterns had helped law enforcement agencies predict and prevent victimization. One of Madison's most innovative contributions to anti-trafficking efforts was the development of survivor councils in major cities across America. These groups, composed entirely of trafficking survivors, advised local law enforcement agencies, social service organizations, and government officials on policies and practices affecting trafficking victims. The councils had proven so effective that international organizations had begun replicating the model worldwide. Alexander's investigations had expanded beyond traditional trafficking cases to explore emerging forms of exploitation in the digital age. His exposés of online gaming platforms that groomed children for trafficking, cryptocurrency schemes that financed trafficking operations, and social media networks that facilitated victim recruitment had led to significant regulatory changes and criminal prosecutions. His work had also focused on supply chain trafficking, investigating how major corporations unknowingly or deliberately profited from trafficked labor. His investigations had led to boycotts, congressional hearings, and fundamental changes in how companies monitored their suppliers and subcontractors. The couple's influence on popular culture had been equally significant. Madison's memoir had been adapted into a critically acclaimed television series that reached millions of viewers with an authentic portrayal of trafficking and recovery. Unlike sensationalized entertainment that exploited trafficking stories for shock value, the series focused on survivor resilience and the systemic changes needed to combat trafficking effectively. The show's impact extended beyond entertainment to real-world action. Each episode included information about recognizing trafficking signs and supporting survivor services, leading to increased donations to anti-trafficking organizations and hundreds of tips that helped rescue victims. Madison and Alexander had also established an annual international conference that brought together survivors, law enforcement officials, researchers, policymakers, and service providers from around the world. The conference had become the premier forum for sharing innovative anti-trafficking strategies and coordinating international efforts to combat human trafficking. The event's highlight was always Madison's keynote address, where she would share updates on the Foundation's work while challenging attendees to think differently about trafficking prevention and survivor support. Her speeches combined hard data with personal storytelling, creating presentations that were both intellectually rigorous and emotionally compelling. As Hope approached her 9th birthday, she had begun expressing interest in learning more about her parents' work. Madison and Alexander had carefully introduced age-appropriate information about trafficking, focusing on concepts of helping people and making the world safer rather than the more traumatic details of their experiences. Hope's natural empathy and leadership abilities suggested she might indeed follow in her parents' footsteps, though Madison was determined to let her daughter choose her own path without pressure or expectations. The most important lesson they wanted to teach Hope was that everyone had the power to make a positive difference in the world, regardless of their chosen profession or life circumstances. The Foundation's financial stability had grown beyond Madison and Alexander's wildest dreams. Corporate partnerships, government grants, individual donations, and revenue from their training programs had created an endowment that would ensure the organization's continued operation for decades to come. This financial security allowed them to take on increasingly ambitious projects and expand their reach to underserved regions worldwide. Their latest initiative involved partnering with technology companies to develop virtual reality training, programs that would help law enforcement officers and social service professionals understand the psychological impact of trafficking on victims. The immersive experiences were designed to increase empathy and improve the quality of care provided to survivors. Madison had also spearheaded an innovative program that provided microloans and business training to trafficking survivors who wanted to start their own enterprises. The program's success rate was remarkable, with over 80% of participants successfully launching sustainable businesses that provided both financial independence and a sense of purpose and accomplishment. As she reflected on the decades since her captivity, Madison marveled at how completely her life had been transformed. The frightened young woman who had been sold at auction had become a globally recognized leader whose work had saved thousands of lives and fundamentally changed how the world approached human trafficking. But perhaps more importantly, she had found a love that transcended the circumstances of their meeting, built a family that brought joy and meaning to every day, and discovered a sense of purpose that made even the most difficult aspects of her work feel worthwhile. Standing in her office overlooking the Richmond skyline, Madison could see the construction site where the Foundation's new regional training center was being built. In 6 months, law enforcement officers from across the southeastern United States would come there to learn cutting-edge techniques for identifying, investigating, and prosecuting trafficking cases. The center would also house a museum documenting the history of trafficking and the stories of survivors who had overcome their experiences to build meaningful lives. Madison hoped that visitors would leave with a deeper understanding of both the severity of trafficking crimes and the incredible resilience of the human spirit when given proper support and opportunities. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Hope's teacher. Hope's presentation about child safety was remarkable. She wants to donate her birthday money to the foundation. You should be very proud. Madison smiled, feeling the same mixture of pride and hope that had sustained her through the most challenging moments of the past decade. Her daughter was growing up to be exactly the kind of person the world needed. Someone who understood that privilege came with responsibility and that everyone had an obligation to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.